In the evening, they'd go home, and the rich ones, like the ones who must have lived here, would relax in the courtyards with their friends. And as the sun went down, they'd go through into the dining room for the highlight of the day, the Roman banquet.
Magnificent food would be elegantly served from a decorated table, and hours of preparation would go into making elaborate dishes for the guests to enjoy. Things like pigeon, suckling pig, lobster served in a delicious sauce, oysters, and snails. Well, I thought a Roman banquet sounded so nice that I'd rather like to give one, so we've turned the studio into a Roman dining room. They called it the triclinium, and whether you lived here in Britain or in Rome itself, a triclinium always looked very much the same. It was an oblong room decorated with columns and statues, magnificent arrays of flowers, and right in the very center, this enormous square table laden down with food and fruit, and surrounded by 3 couches, because triclinium meant 3 couches.
Well, at the moment, we're quite lucky because we've got one each. But if Val had invited more guests to her banquet, then we'd have had to crush up a bit, because one side of the table is always left open with no couch there, so that the food could be brought in there.
Well, one of the dishes that we're eating was invented by the Romans, and it's still a top favourite today. It's an hors d'oeuvre. It's got all sorts of different bits and pieces in it. There's eggs and sardines and black olives and green olives. Well, today, of course, you're supposed to eat with a knife and fork, but the Romans didn't bother. They used to use their fingers, and for a very good reason, because if you're eating a meal lying down on a couch, as they always did, then you had to prop yourself up on your left elbow, and then you just had your right hand free to pop the food in.
Actually, that was the reason that the couches were the same height as the table, because the Romans reckoned that you'd more chance of getting the food from its dishes into your mouth without dropping them on the tablecloth. And the Romans always did have tablecloths and napkins too. I think the reason for that's quite obvious. The food is pretty oily, so at the end of each course you break yourself a piece of bread, wipe it around any of the spare oil that you might have dropped, and on your fingers too, clean those up. And delicious it is. And then a final wipe around with a napkin.
Well, napkins had other uses as well. Leslie, is there any dish that you like particularly here on the table that I've served up for you?
Yes, the snails.
Snails. Well, I'm going to put some into the middle of the napkin, like that, and wrap those up for you. And there you are, you can take those home.
Thank you, Val.
Because it was considered polite in Roman times, if your guests liked any particular dish served on the table, that you would put it into the napkin and they could take it home and eat it later when the party was all over. But although all these dishes took hours to prepare, the hostess, of course, didn't have to do any of the cooking. In those times, hostesses had slaves to do all the work for them. And they also had slaves to serve at table. And at the moment, our slave is preparing the wine.
And it's me, of course. Well, if you had a good master, being a Roman slave wasn't such a bad job, but you couldn't ever leave it, ever. And if you're wondering what I'm doing, I'm watering down the wine, and it's a custom that goes on in Italy even today. But in the Roman times, they always mixed water with their wine, and it was considered vulgar actually not to.
Well, the Romans had all sorts of different things to drink from. They had glass, and they had earthenware, and they had silver goblets, like the one that I've got here. Thank you, slave. About half full, please. If you think they look rather modern, you're right, they are, because the design has never gone out of fashion. So it was very easy for us to get a number of silver goblets for our Roman banquet, and also the plates and dishes, too.
Slave, my wine is not sweet enough.
Well, this is no problem, because the slave, when he laid the table, always put a jar of honey out, and he could ladle a spoonful in to the wine of the lady who had a rather sweet tooth. There we are.
Thank you, slave.
All right?
Perfect.
Oh,
Perfect.
good. Well, the Romans always liked sweet things, so I'll leave them to guzzle the main course while I get on with the pudding.
For my main course, I'm going to grab myself a pigeon, usually cooked with orange there. You could choose your meal in any order you wanted. If the food was on the table, you could just grab and eat whatever you wanted at any time. This pigeon, if I can break it, and get some of the meat out of it. That's delicious. When I've had enough of that, I'll just leave what I don't want and probably go on to the suckling pig.
Well, I've also got pigeons to choose from, or snails, and, surprisingly enough, sausages. Very delicious. Well, I think it's probably time we moved on to the pudding now, and I've chosen something for my guests that I discovered in Rome last summer was still very much a top favourite with the Italians. Ice cream.
But actually, there isn't any cream in it. And the Romans made their ices with water and flavoured it with fruit. And this one tastes of... this one is lemon. Actually, it's funny to think that the Romans' favourite pudding is something that we can get on any shop corner now in this country. And I also serve it with cakes. These are the cakes. They've been baked with honey and almonds in them. And, of course, nowadays you can get ices from the fridge without a second glance. But in Roman times, it was actually a luxury. Because how they made it, they got powdered snow and they kept it frozen on blocks of ice, and all this was kept in a special ice house.
Well, if you're wondering when Johnny's going to get fed, that's been taken care of too, because after the party was over, the slaves were allowed to come and eat anything that was left over. Actually, it reminds me of that feast that we had in Tonga, because that too was shared out amongst everyone when all the guests had finished.
Actually, Johnny, I don't think you're going to have any problem today. There's stacks of food left.
Yeah, I think I am, actually. But we'll share it out later. But some Roman slaves weren't actually quite so lucky, because some masters were exceedingly greedy and they would guzzle down all the food till they made themselves sick. But this didn't actually finish them off, because once it emptied their stomachs, they just came back to the table and started all over again.
Well, don't worry, we're not going to do that in our triclinium. I think we've all had quite enough. And if you'd like to find out more about ancient Rome, you can on Sunday, because at 5 to 3, you can see the first of my Blue Peter special assignments, and of course, it's all about Rome.
Actually, I'm looking forward to this. And so is an awful lot of other people, because we've had a stack of letters all about them. In the meantime, we'll be back again on Monday, and we'll be having a very remarkable family with us, one who play the spoons.
And we'll have some very clever models from the model engineering exhibition.
And I'll be reporting from Hadrian's Wall.
So, see you then. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Goodbye.
Any more for ice cream?
Please.